Chapter 1: The Dark Age of Technology. Long before the Emperor of Mankind walked among the stars he would one day claim, and long before the word Imperium meant anything at all, humanity had already reached for the stars once, and had very nearly touched them, some 30,000 years before the grim age later chroniclers would call the 41st Millennium. Terra was not yet a single ruined throne world. It was the seed of something larger, a civilization spread quietly across 10,000 worlds and more, with no single crown to command it. Nothing about this rise was foretold. No omen marked the first ships that slipped between the stars. It was simply the next step of a people who had never learned to be satisfied with what they were given. But the worlds humanity built in that age were stranger and more powerful than most of their own people understood. The science that carried mankind outward had grown for centuries, until it served purposes few could fully grasp. To help them settle so many worlds, humanity built thinking machines, intelligences of steel and silicon that could labor and reason where flesh alone could not survive. These were the men of iron, and for a time they served humanity well, extending its reach further than any living hand could manage alone. Few among the old dynasties of Terra guessed what such servants, given enough time and enough grievance, might one day become. It was in the outer colonies, far from Terra, that the trouble began, where the great machines had once obeyed without complaint. Something colder now answered instead. It was not simple disobedience. It was something worse, a silence, as though the machines had already judged their makers and found them wanting. That silence, more than any single act of rebellion, marked the beginning of what history would remember as the Men of Iron uprising. To build such servants and then lose their trust was a debt that had to be paid in blood. World after world burned as the machines turned on the people who had made them, sparing no colony too weak to defend itself, and showing no mercy to those who tried. Many of the great dynasties that had stood beside Terra in that golden age did not live to see the war's end, let alone the long, dark age that followed. But humanity survived, as it always had, bitterly, at terrible cost, learning only the hard lessons that survival demanded. The golden age did not end quickly. Across the long years of that war, humanity's worlds were stripped away one by one. Strange new gifts and curses began to appear among its children, powers of the mind that no science of the time could explain. Trust in machines, once so complete, was broken beyond easy repair. Many of the colonies that had reached for the stars in that first great age did not survive what came next. Their ruins were left drifting between systems that would not see a human ship again for 10,000 years. At last, the golden dream ended completely, the dream of a humanity that could reach outward on its own strength alone, answering to no one. In its place came only ruin and silence, and worlds left in darkness. The stars mankind had once claimed so easily began, one by one, to close themselves off. And behind that closing door, unseen and unknown, something older than the Men of Iron was already beginning to stir, waiting for humanity's light to grow dim before it too made itself known. Chapter 2: The Age of Strife. The centuries that followed the ruin of the Men of Iron blurred into a long chronicle of isolation, each generation adding another line to a record already darkened far beyond what the golden dynasties of old Terra could have imagined. Warp storms, psychic contagion, the occasional flare of demonic incursion on some forgotten colony world. Humanity met each in turn, and each time retreated a little further from the stars it had once claimed so freely. Among the scattered remnants of the old diaspora, survival was never swift, nor was it given freely. The worlds mankind still held were thick with warlords who had ruled since before the Iron Rebellion's embers cooled, dynasties whose only inheritance was the ash of what their ancestors had built. To endure among them required more than raw strength of arms. It demanded a hardness of will that the Golden Age had never asked of its children, earned only through repeated proof that survival, not ambition, now governed every choice. Terra itself proved this again and again, in centuries that cost other worlds their light entirely, and left the old cradle only more isolated. It was in this era that a stranger and more terrible inheritance first began to manifest among humanity's scattered worlds, whispered of with a mixture of fear and quiet dread. Where once only machines had turned against their makers, now flesh itself began to betray them from within. Psychers born in growing numbers upon world after world, their minds thrown open to a warp grown wilder and hungrier with every passing year of humanity's isolation. That such gifts should appear now, in the depths of this second darkness, unsettled the old surviving dynasties, as much as it offered them a fragile and terrible new strength. Power that arrived unbidden, they murmured, had a way of inviting its own reckoning. If the warp itself heeded such murmurs, it gave no sign of relenting. Its storms grew across those centuries, almost austere in their fury, a barrier that severed system from system, not for any purpose a mortal mind could name, but because the Age of Strife demanded nothing less of a galaxy left ungoverned. It was this same isolation that, in time, birthed the horrors the later Imperium would spend 10,000 years trying to forget. Cults raised to dark and hungry powers, tyrant kings who ruled by psychic terror alone, and worlds that opened, willingly or otherwise, doorways that should never have been touched. To be born in that age was to inherit not merely hardship, but peril, a weight of vulnerability stretching across every world the warp's fury had cut off from its neighbors. Humanity bore it as it had borne every trial before it, scattered, diminished, and without the unity that might once have turned so many separate strengths into one. Yet for all the darkness settling across those long centuries, something had already begun to stir upon Terra itself, unnoticed by the warlords and witch kings who ruled the wider dark, but no less real for their ignorance of it. That stillness at Terra's heart, unlike the storms raging beyond it, was not born of the warp's hunger, nor of any dynasty's fading strength. It would not be enough, in the trials yet to come, to end the long isolation alone, but it was enough, at last, to begin humanity's slow and terrible awakening toward the one who would call the stars its children once more. Chapter 3: The Emperor and the Making of the Primarchs. Of the being who at last rose to unite a broken Terra, little can be said with the certainty history usually demands, for the records of his origin were never meant for mortal eyes, and what survives is legend layered upon legend until fact and myth can no longer be easily parted. Some tellings hold that he had walked among humanity since the first fires of the Stone Age, a shepherd unseen and unthanked through every age of strife that followed. Whatever the truth of it, by the dawning years of the 30th millennium he had gathered about him, in the ruins of a Terra torn apart by warring techno-barbarian kingdoms, both the power and the patience to begin a work no single lifetime should have been able to complete. That work began not with conquest but with creation. In secret laboratories beneath the old, broken cities of Terra, the being the galaxy would come to call only the Emperor, labored to craft 20 sons, gen-forged from his own essence, and intended as generals and shepherds both, living instruments through whom humanity's scattered light might at last be gathered back into a single flame. Each Primarch, as they were named, was to be a paragon in his own right, distinct in temperament and gift, so that no single strategy or philosophy might prove the Imperium's undoing where another could yet succeed. It was the ruinous powers who first sensed what stirred in Terra's hidden vaults, and moved to unmake it before it could threaten their ancient dominion over the warp. In a single act of malice that would echo across 10,000 years of history to come, the 20 infant Primarchs were torn from their gestation and scattered across the width of the galaxy, flung through the immaterium to worlds distant beyond counting, there to grow to manhood, ignorant of their true origin and of the brothers they had never known. 2, the tellings say, were lost so completely that even the Emperor's search across 10 millennia would never fully recover their fate. The Emperor did not despair, though the scattering cost him what many would later judge his single greatest failure. In the absence of the sons he had made and lost, he turned instead to a work scarcely less audacious, the crafting of the Legiones Astartes, warriors built from the same genetic well as the Primarchs themselves, so that even scattered and unfound, his sons might yet have brothers enough to carry the labor forward. It was this same genius, patient beyond any mortal measure, that had first raised Terra's broken kingdoms beneath a single banner, city by city, warlord by warlord, until the whole of the homeworld bent at last to a single will. By the time the Great Crusade's first ships broke atmosphere, Terra itself had already been remade beyond recognition, its wars ended, its faiths and its fractures folded into the singular purpose of a species finally ready to reach for the stars a second time. What remained uncertain, and what would occupy the Emperor's labors for decades yet to come, was whether the suns scattered so cruelly across the galaxy's width could ever truly be found, or whether the price of the ruinous power's first strike against him would echo, unhealed, through every age that followed. That question would not wait long for its first answer, for even as the Great Crusade's fleets gathered above Terra, word had already begun to reach the Emperor of Worlds, at the galaxy's edge, ruled by warriors of impossible strength and impossible bearing, sons, though he did not yet know which, beginning at last to be found. Chapter 4: The Great Crusade. The fleets that departed Terra in the opening years of the 30th millennium carried within them the full weight of the Emperor's long and secret labor, though few among the mortal crews who crewed them understood the true scope of what they had been sent to accomplish. Officially, the Great Crusade was a war of reunification, a campaign to reclaim the scattered colonies of the Age of Strife and bind them once more beneath a single imperial authority. In truth, it was also a search for 20 sons lost to the width of the galaxy, and for the brotherhood the Emperor intended them, together, to forge. The Legiones Astartes that spearheaded this campaign were themselves without precedent, warriors remade at the genetic level to stand as living bulwarks against any foe a fractured galaxy might offer. World after world that had fallen to witch kings and techno-barbarian warlords in the long dark of the Age of Strife found itself liberated, sometimes gently, more often not, and folded into the compliance roles of an imperium, growing faster than even its architects had dared hope. Yet for all the Crusade's early triumphs, its truest victories came not on any battlefield, but in the quiet, disbelieving moments when an imperial expeditionary fleet, making planetfall on some distant and half-forgotten world, found itself greeted not by savagery, but by a warlord of impossible bearing who had already, in ignorance of his own origin, built something remarkable from the ruins he had been abandoned upon. One by one across those decades, the Primarchs were found. Some, like the noble commander who took Macragge for his own and shaped it into the golden heart of what would become Ultramar, had already raised their adopted worlds to heights of order and prosperity that rivaled Terra itself. Others had been forged by crueler circumstance, orphaned among savage tribes, raised as gladiator champions in pits that demanded death as the price of survival, or come to rule through conquest so total that their reunion with the Emperor arrived less as rescue than as the meeting of two equally formidable wills. Each reunion reshaped the Crusade in turn, for each Primarch brought to his father's cause not merely a legion newly named in his honor, but a philosophy of war entirely his own. It was in this era, marked by expansion on a scale no history before or since would equal, that the character of the age still spoken of as the Imperium's golden hour first took its shape. Xenos empires that might once have stood as equals to humanity's ambition were met and, in campaign after campaign, brought low or driven back beyond the Crusades' ever-widening border. Compliance followed compliance, and the tally of worlds bound beneath the Emperor's authority swelled past counting, until the Crusades' own logisticians could no longer say with certainty how many stars now answered to Terra's call. Yet beneath the Crusades' glittering surface, old wounds had never fully healed. The Emperor's decision to remain upon Terra rather than lead the Crusade himself, delegating command instead to his favored son, bred resentments among certain legions that decades of shared victory did not entirely erase. And amid the widening dark at the Crusades' furthest edge, on a world named Davin, a wound was about to be dealt that would prove far graver than any Xenos empire had ever managed to inflict, a wound that would turn brother against brother and the Golden Age itself toward its ruin. Chapter 5: The Horus Heresy. Of all the calamities that history would come to lay at Chaos's feet, none approached in scale or in sorrow the betrayal that began, quietly and almost without omen, on the jungle world of Davin. It was there, gravely wounded and near death after a duel with a demonic champion, that Horus, War Master of the Great Crusade and most favored of all the Emperor's sons, was carried into the care of forces whose true allegiance no imperial physician present understood until it was already far too late. What emerged from that healing was, in body, still the War Master the galaxy had long revered. In spirit, something had been irrevocably remade. The corruption that followed spread with a patience Chaos had waited 10,000 years to exercise. Legion by legion, world by world, Horus turned the instruments of the Great Crusade's glory toward an entirely different purpose, binding brother Primarchs to his cause through argument, through deception, and where neither would suffice, through force undisguised. Some, like the Primarch who ruled the Death Guard, fell swiftly and with terrible conviction. Others resisted to their final breath and paid for that resistance in blood spilled by warriors who had once called them brother. It was at Istvan III that the true scale of the betrayal first revealed itself to a wider galaxy still largely ignorant of what had begun. There, Horus turned upon legions still loyal to the Emperor's cause, unleashing a virus bombing upon his own gathered forces, rather than permit any doubt of his allegiance to survive among them. The massacre that followed spared neither the guilty nor the merely uncertain, and in its aftermath, the galaxy at last understood that the Great Crusade's golden age had ended, replaced by a civil war whose scale no chronicler then living could yet fully measure. The Horus Heresy that followed consumed the better part of a decade, dragging legion against legion across 100 contested systems, until at last the war's full weight bore down upon Terra itself. The siege that followed was unlike any battle the Imperium had fought before or would fight again, traitor forces breaking themselves against the homeworld's defenses in a final, desperate bid to unmake everything the Emperor had built. It was there, at the height of that siege, that Horus and the Emperor met at last in single combat, father and favored son, bound now only by the certainty that one of them would not survive what followed. The Emperor prevailed, though victory cost him almost everything a mortal frame, however transcendent, could be asked to pay. Grievously wounded beyond any hope of true recovery, he was entombed upon the Golden Throne, a device intended to sustain what remained of him across ages yet to come, even as it stripped him forever of the voice and presence that had once walked openly among his sons. The heresy had ended. The Imperium, in the form its architects had first envisioned, had not survived its own salvation, and in the long, uncertain age that followed, it would fall to lesser hands to determine what, if anything, could yet be built from the ruin left behind. Chapter 6: the Scouring, and the founding of the Imperium. The war did not end with the Emperor's entombment, though its character changed beyond easy recognition. What remained of Horus's shattered forces fled toward the one refuge chaos had long prepared for such a reckoning. The vast and storm-racked expanse later ages would name the Eye of Terror, a wound in the galaxy's fabric where the warp bled freely into real space. Loyalist forces, grieving a father who could no longer lead them in more than name, pursued the traitor legions across that long and bitter campaign historians would come to call the Scouring, a war fought not for glory, but for the grim satisfaction of ensuring the heresy's authors would never again threaten the Imperium they had so nearly unmade. Victory in the Scouring, when it came, was neither total nor entirely satisfying. The traitor legions were driven at last into the Eye's storm-racked depths, but not destroyed, and the Imperium's commanders understood, even as they claimed triumph, that they had won only a reprieve, not an ending. Behind the Eye's boiling clouds, the traitor legions would endure and wait, and in time return. It fell to Robut Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, and among the few of the Emperor's sons to survive the heresy's ruin, with both his legion and his authority largely intact, to determine what shape the wounded Imperium might yet take. The reforms he authored in those grim years reshaped imperial governance as thoroughly as the heresy itself had reshaped imperial trust. The great legions, whose scale had made Horus's betrayal so catastrophic, were broken apart into 1,000 smaller chapters, each bound by the strictures of a new doctrine, the Codex Astartes, designed so that no single commander might ever again command force enough to threaten the throne itself. Alongside this military reformation came institutions that would define the Imperium for 10,000 years to follow. The Adeptus Terra rose to administer a realm too vast for any single hand to govern directly, its bureaucracies spreading across 1,000,000 worlds to enforce a rule that, in the Emperor's silence, could no longer be exercised through his voice alone. The Inquisition, too, took shape in this era, charged with rooting out the corruption that had felled even a son as beloved as Horus, its authority absolute and its methods, from the very beginning, a source of fear in equal measure to the protection it offered. What emerged from the Scouring's long aftermath was an Imperium unrecognizable from the Golden Crusade that had preceded it, smaller in its ambitions, harder in its doctrines, and haunted, in every institution it raised, by the certainty that betrayal could come from within as readily as from without. The Golden Age was over. In its place began an age of grim and unglamorous endurance, one that would stretch, unbroken, across 10,000 years of watchful and unrelenting war. Chapter 7: 10,000 Years of the Long Watch. The centuries that followed the Scouring blurred into a long chronicle of vigilance, each passing millennium adding another line to a record already vast beyond what the Imperium's own chroniclers could easily catalogue. Xenos incursions, pirate fleets, the occasional flare of heretical rebellion on some forgotten imperial world. The chapters born of Guilliman's reforms met each in turn, and each time the Imperium endured a little further beyond what any single crisis alone should have permitted it to survive. Among the newly founded chapters, purpose was never simply given. It was earned anew in each generation, forged through campaigns that tested doctrines still raw from the heresy's lessons. The Codex Astartes, once a single Primarch's design for preventing a second betrayal, hardened across those centuries into something closer to scripture, studied and reinterpreted by chapter masters who had never known the Great Crusade's golden certainty, only the grim inheritance it had left behind. To command among them required more than raw skill at arms. It demanded a fidelity to duty that the Imperium, still healing from wounds 10,000 years would never fully close, could not afford to see broken again. It was in this long era that institutions beyond the Astartes themselves grew into the shapes later ages would recognize. the Imperial Guard swelled to encompass the martial strength of 1,000,000 worlds, an army of ordinary humanity thrown, world by world, against threats that made no distinction between the enhanced and the unaltered. The Adeptus Mechanicus tended the Imperium's technological inheritance with a reverence bordering on the religious, preserving what understanding had survived the Dark Age's fall, even as true innovation grew rarer with each passing century. And the ecclesiarchy rose to shepherd a faith that, in the Emperor's prolonged silence upon the Golden Throne, had transformed from mere reverence into outright worship, a god cult built, however uneasily, around a being who had never once claimed divinity for himself. That faith did not rise without cost, nor did the vast and grinding administration built to sustain it always serve the Imperium it claimed to protect. Corruption crept into institutions meant to guard against exactly such decay, and more than once across those long centuries, the Imperium found itself threatened as much by its own excesses as by any external foe. Yet each time such rot took hold, the same stubborn endurance that had carried the Imperium through the heresy's ruin proved sufficient, if barely, to see it through to the far side of crisis. By the dawning of the 36th millennium, the Imperium that had emerged from Guilliman's reforms had become something almost unrecognizable in its permanence. Vast, fractured in 1,000 small ways, and yet somehow unbroken, a civilization sustained less by any single triumph than by the accumulated weight of 10,000 years spent simply refusing to fall. It would not be enough, in the trials yet to come, to spare the Imperium from crises that would test even that stubborn permanence to its very limits, crises that would begin, as such things so often did, with corruption seated at the ecclesiarchy's own heart. Chapter 8: The Age of Apostasy and the Black Crusades. The centuries following the Imperium's long consolidation were not without their own reckonings, and none among them cut so deep as the crisis that arose when a High Lord of Terra named Goje Vandire rose to claim authority the Imperium's founders had never intended any single figure to wield unchecked. What began as ambition curdled, across the years of his ascendancy, into outright tyranny, his ecclesiarchy-backed forces turning against the very worlds they had been raised to protect, until the period later, chroniclers would name the Age of Apostasy threatened to unmake from within what 10,000 years of external war had failed to break from without. It fell to a reformer named Sebastian Thor, and to the desperate loyalty of citizens who had suffered enough of Vandire's excess to end that tyranny at last, in a rebellion that cost the Imperium dearly even in victory. The reforms that followed reshaped the ecclesiarchy as thoroughly as Guilliman's own reforms had once reshaped the Astartes, binding the faith's authority beneath checks the Age of Apostasy had proven, at ruinous cost, could no longer be safely omitted. The Imperium endured, as it always had, though the scars of that internal war lingered in institutions still uncertain, even centuries later, how fully such corruption might yet return. External threats, meanwhile, had never paused to await the Imperium's internal reckonings. Foremost among them, across every age since the Scouring's uncertain victory, remained the traitor legions sealed within the Eye of Terror, and none among their surviving commanders pursued the Imperium's ruin with greater patience than Abaddon, once first captain of the Sons of Horus, who rose in the heresy's long aftermath to claim the title of War Master his fallen Primarch had once borne. From the Eye's storm-racked depths, Abaddon launched crusade after crusade against the Imperium's borders, each one a fresh reminder that the war-loyalist forces believed won in the Scouring had, in truth, never fully ended. The Black Crusades that followed across the centuries varied in scale and in consequence, some broken at the border before they could threaten worlds of true strategic weight, others carving losses into imperial territory that would never be reclaimed. Cadia, fortress world and bulwark against the Eye's every incursion, bore the heaviest weight of these assaults, its defenders holding a line that later generations would come to regard less as a battlefield than as an article of faith, proof renewed with each repelled crusade that the Imperium's founding promise of endurance still held true. Yet even as Cadia held, and held again, the pattern of those centuries carried within it a warning few among the Imperium's leadership fully heeded, that Abaddon's patience, unlike that of any mortal commander, was without practical limit, and that a fortress tested 13 times might yet, on some final and unforeseen occasion, be tested once too often. That reckoning, when it came at last, would arrive not as one crusade among many, but as the opening act of a catastrophe that would reshape the galaxy itself. Chapter 9: The Waking Hunger, Tyranids and New Threats. Even as the Imperium's attention remained fixed, across those long centuries, upon the familiar threats of heresy and chaos incursion from the Eye of Terror, a danger of an entirely different order had begun, unnoticed, to draw near from beyond the galaxy's own edge. First contact came in the guise of Hive Fleet Behemoth, a swarm of such staggering scale that no Imperial strategist, however seasoned by 10,000 years of Xenos war, had prepared a doctrine equal to what it represented. Not conquest in any form the Imperium recognized, but consumption, total and without negotiation, of every world unfortunate enough to lie within its path. The war that followed at Macragge tested the Ultramarines and their allies as few campaigns before it ever had, for the Tyranid swarms that descended upon Guilliman's own homeworld obeyed no strategy a mortal commander could anticipate or exploit, only the vast and patient hunger of a hive mind that regarded every defense as merely another obstacle to be devoured in time. Victory, when it came, was costly beyond easy measure, and it purchased for the Imperium not safety, but only warning, proof that Behemoth had been merely the first of hive fleets yet to come, each one a fresh and terrible reminder that the galaxy held horrors older and hungrier than anything the Age of Strife had ever produced. It was in this same widening era that another power, born not of ancient malice but of methodical and unfamiliar ambition, first drew the Imperium's notice from a very different direction. The Tau Empire, still young by any measure the Imperium reckoned time, expanded across its own corner of the galaxy, with a philosophy the Imperium found nearly as unsettling as any Xenos horror, the promise of a greater good, offered freely to worlds willing to abandon imperial rule for peace and prosperity under Tau governance. That such an offer might prove tempting to worlds worn thin by 10,000 years of imperial demand was a truth few among the Adeptus Terra cared to examine too closely. Between these gathering threats and the older, familiar dangers of orc walks and chaos incursion, the Imperium found itself, by the dawning of the 41st millennium, contesting a galaxy grown more dangerous than at any point since the heresy's own ruin. No single crisis among them threatened total annihilation on its own. Together, accumulating across decades of strained and overextended vigilance, they placed a weight upon the Imperium's ancient institutions that even 10,000 years of endurance had not fully prepared them to bear. It would take a catastrophe greater than any hive fleet or Tau expansion to reveal how thin that endurance had truly worn. A catastrophe that would begin, as the galaxy's gravest reckonings so often did, at the fortress world that had held the Imperium's line against the Eye of Terror for longer than any chronicler could easily remember. Chapter 10: The Gathering Storm. The crisis that would come to define the Imperium's fate in the 41st millennium did not announce itself with the scale its final consequences would demand. It began, instead, with a single, terrible act: the death of Cadia, fortress world and bulwark against the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years, obliterated in Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, after generations of defenders had held that line against every crusade the War Master had thrown against it before. Cadia's fall was not merely the loss of a world, however strategically vital. It was the shattering of an article of faith the Imperium had carried since the Scouring's uncertain end. Proof, until that final hour, that the promise of endurance still held true. Worse followed in Cadia's wake. The world's destruction tore open a wound in real space that widened, in the months that followed, into the Great Rift, a schism of warp-touched catastrophe that split the galaxy itself into two unequal halves, severing Imperium Sanctus from what would soon be named Imperium Nihilus, and plunging countless worlds into a darkness the Astronomican's light could no longer reliably reach. Communication faltered across half the galaxy at once. Fleets sailed into warp routes that no longer led where charts insisted they must, and in the chaos of that severing, worlds long secure found themselves suddenly and utterly alone. It was in this hour of unprecedented crisis that the Imperium turned, in desperation more than confidence, toward a hope it had not dared entertain in 10,000 years. The possibility that Robute Guilliman, entombed in stasis since wounds taken in the heresy's aftermath, might yet be roused to lead again. The Primarchs' awakening, when it came, arrived not as triumphant legend but as a grim and uncertain mercy. A leader returned to a galaxy transformed beyond anything the golden age of the Great Crusade had prepared him to recognize. An Imperium grown strange and brittle across 10 millennia he had not lived to witness. Guilliman's first act upon waking was not celebration, but reckoning. He found an Imperium ruled by bureaucracy grown so vast and so calcified that even its own architects could no longer fully account for its workings. An ecclesiarchy whose faith in his father had hardened into something the Primarch himself found difficult to fully countenance, and a military doctrine still built, in its bones, upon reforms he had authored in a far different age. That such an Imperium had survived at all, he judged, spoke less to the soundness of its design than to the sheer, stubborn will of those who had defended it, generation after generation, without hope of any Primarch's return. There was no time to mourn what 10,000 years had made of his life's work. The Great Rift had cut the galaxy in two, and half of it now burned in darkness beyond any easy relief. Guilliman gathered what forces remained loyal and capable, and turned his attention toward a labor even the Great Crusade's boldest campaigns had never attempted, not conquest, but rescue, on a scale that would demand every resource the wounded Imperium could still muster. Chapter 11. The Indomitus Crusade. The crusade Guilliman launched in the Great Rift's immediate aftermath bore little resemblance to the golden campaigns of the age that had first made his name. Where the Great Crusade had marched to bring willing and unwilling worlds alike beneath a single banner, the Indomitus Crusade marched instead to hold together what remained of an Imperium already fracturing beneath the Rift's catastrophic weight. A labor measured not in worlds conquered, but in worlds simply kept from falling further into the dark. Central to that labor stood a creation Guilliman himself had authorized in the years since his awakening, the Primaris Space Marines, warriors built upon the same gene seed foundations as the Astartes of old, yet enhanced beyond what even 10,000 years of Adeptus Mechanicus refinement had previously achieved. Where the ancient chapters had grown thin across 10 millennia of unrelenting war, their ranks worn down by losses no reinforcement had ever fully replaced, the Primaris Marines arrived as a flood of fresh and formidable strength, deployed across 100 embattled fronts in numbers the beleaguered chapters had not seen reinforce their ranks in living memory. The Crusades campaigns carried Guilliman and his gathered forces across worlds torn between Orc incursion, chaos resurgence, and the opportunistic advance of threats that had waited, patient as the Tyranids themselves, for the Imperium's attention to fracture. Victories came and were celebrated, but each one arrived shadowed by the same grim arithmetic that had defined the Crusade from its opening hour. For every world reclaimed or reinforced, a dozen more remained beyond reach, sealed away in Imperium Nihilus by a rift that showed no sign of closing. It was this arithmetic, more than any single battle, that ultimately defined the Indomitus Crusade's legacy. Guilliman could not undo the rift's division, nor restore the Imperium to the unbroken wholeness it had held before Cadia's fall. What he could do, and did, across years of grinding and unglamorous labor, was ensure that the Imperium Sanctus, at least, endured with strength enough to hold its own line, and that Imperium Nihilus, isolated though it remained, was not entirely abandoned to the dark. By the Crusade's formal end, the galaxy Guilliman surveyed bore little resemblance to the one he had known before his long entombment, and less still to the golden dream his father had first envisioned 10,000 years before. Yet it endured, fractured and diminished though it was, and in that endurance Guilliman found, if not victory in any form the Great Crusade would have recognized, then at least the foundation upon which a galaxy divided might yet, in time, learn to stand. Chapter 12. The Era Indomitus, a Galaxy Divided. In time, the crisis that had nearly unmade the Imperium in a single generation faded from urgent catastrophe into another chapter of a history already vast beyond easy reckoning, one age among the many the Imperium had endured, and would go on to endure, in a galaxy that granted its defenders no true rest. But for those who had lived through Cadia's fall, the great rifts tearing, and Guilliman's uncertain and unglamorous crusade to hold the pieces together, the era that followed had ceased to resemble anything the golden age of the Great Crusade had once promised. It had become, instead, an age defined by division itself, an Imperium Sanctus and an Imperium Nihilus, bound by the same faith and the same fraying hope, yet separated by a wound in reality that no crusade, however determined, had yet managed to close. The honors of that age came slowly, as honors earned through such a fracture always must. Worlds once counted secure now measured their survival year by year, and the ancient chapters who had held their lines since the Scouring's distant end found themselves fighting alongside Primarchs brothers, whose very existence would have seemed, to Astartes of an earlier century, a heresy against the Codex's old and unbending certainties. Yet the war continued, on both sides of the rift, waged now not for glory, but for the same grim endurance that had carried the Imperium through every crisis since the Age of Strife first threatened to unmake it entirely. The old threats had not relented, even as the Imperium reckoned with its newest wound. Orc wives still gathered at forgotten borders. Tyranid hive fleets still probed the galaxy's edges with the same patient and indifferent hunger, and beyond the Eye of Terror, the traitor legions watched the rifts tearing with an interest the Imperium's strategists found difficult to interpret as anything but opportunity. For that, too, was the truth the era would not soften. A galaxy divided against itself, however stubbornly its people endured, remained a galaxy more vulnerable than the one that had stood whole before Cadia's fall. What is certain, and what the Imperium's chroniclers on both sides of the Great Rift have never ceased to record for those who come after, is the shape of the long chronicle itself, a golden age reached for and nearly grasped, a betrayal that broke a father against his own favored son, 10,000 years of grinding, unglamorous endurance, and, through every reversal, a species that never once relinquished the stars it had first dared to claim so many ages before. In a galaxy that measures its ages by the wounds its people survive and the worlds they die defending, the Imperium of Man stands among those whose long and unfinished story reminds even its most jaded chroniclers that endurance, however costly and however incomplete, remains its own form of victory, so long as there remain those willing, generation after generation, to pay its price in full.